She paid $3 for a rusted diving bell that had been sitting behind a dead man's shack for nearly 40 years. When she finally cut open the sealed iron compartment inside it, she found something that should have been at the bottom of the sea. It carried the name of a ship that disappeared in 1849 and a message written by someone who was supposed to have drowned with it. But the strangest part was this: the wreck had never been found, and the message claimed the ship never sank where everyone believed it had. Before we uncover what was hidden inside that bell, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us what you think she found, and subscribe to the Mountain Tribe for more forgotten stories from the world's most isolated places. In the autumn of 1878, Clara Whitmore arrived at a remote settlement called Blackwater Point with less than $6 in her purse, a broken wagon axle, and no intention of staying longer than a week. Blackwater Point was not really a town. It was a scattering of timber cabins along a cold northern inlet where the mountains came almost directly down into the water. There was one general store, one abandoned chapel, a smokehouse, a small pier, and perhaps 20 families spread across several miles of rough coastline. For most of the year, the settlement was cut off from the outside world. The nearest proper road was nearly 70 miles away. There was no telegraph station, no regular mail, no doctor, and after the first heavy snow, even the coastal trail became dangerous. Clara had come there because her late father's final papers contained a strange reference to the place. He had spent most of his life working as a surveyor and coastal engineer. In his final months, while illness weakened him, he had repeatedly mentioned a vessel called the Mercy Bell. Clara had never heard the name before. Her father had told her only one thing: if you ever reach Blackwater Point, ask the old fisherman about the wreck. She had assumed it was something connected to his work. Instead, every fisherman she questioned gave her the same answer: there was no wreck, not anymore. The Mercy Bell had disappeared 29 years earlier. According to the story passed down through the settlement, the vessel had been carrying mining equipment, food, tools, and several passengers when a violent storm struck the coast. The ship vanished. No survivors returned. No bodies were recovered. And despite decades of searching, nobody had ever found the wreck. The locals had eventually stopped talking about it. Clara, however, could not stop. One evening, an elderly fisherman named Elias Vane told her something that changed the direction of her search. He said the ship had been carrying an experimental diving bell. The bell had been designed to allow men to descend beneath the water and inspect underwater structures. It was crude by later standards, but for the time, it was an impressive piece of engineering. According to Elias, the captain intended to use it to inspect an underwater mining site near the inlet. But the diving bell disappeared with the ship. At least, that was what everyone believed. 3 days later, Clara found the bell. It was not underwater. It was sitting behind the rotting cabin of a dead trapper named Silas Crow. The bell was half buried in weeds and mud. Its iron surface was orange with rust. The lower rim was badly damaged. A thick chain still hung from its upper frame. One side bore a faded brass plate. Most of the lettering had disappeared. Make out 2 words: Mercy Bell. She stared at it for several minutes. The owner of the property, a widow named Martha Vale, told Clara that Silas had dragged the object from the shoreline decades earlier. He had never explained where he found it. Martha wanted it gone. Clara asked how much she wanted. $3. Clara counted her remaining money. Then she bought it. She did not know that those $3 were about to uncover the biggest secret Blackwater Point had buried for nearly 30 years. The bell was far heavier than it looked. Clara and Martha's teenage son spent most of the afternoon dragging it toward Clara's temporary cabin. When Clara cleaned away the mud, she discovered something strange. The bell had two chambers. The outer structure was badly corroded, but inside it was a second iron compartment. That compartment had been deliberately sealed. Not welded, not riveted, sealed with a thick layer of black pitch. Someone had wanted to keep water out. Clara remembered something her father had taught her when she was young. He had once told her that people rarely went to extraordinary trouble to protect something worthless. So she spent the next day opening it. It took hours. The pitch had hardened like stone. She heated the metal, she worked a narrow blade into the seams. She nearly gave up twice. Then, shortly after sunset, the inner compartment shifted. A rush of stale air escaped. Clara froze. Inside was a small copper cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. There was also a brass key, and beneath them was a folded sheet of paper. The paper should have been destroyed by moisture decades earlier. Instead, it had been protected inside the cylinder. Clara unfolded it beside the lamp. The handwriting was faded but readable. The first line said, "To whoever finds this, the Mercy Bell did not sink where they told you." Clara read the sentence twice. Then she continued. The writer identified himself as Thomas Reed, the ship's assistant engineer. He claimed the vessel had survived the storm. The ship had not been destroyed. It had been deliberately hidden. And the reason was not weather. It was murder. Thomas wrote that Captain Nathaniel Crowe had discovered something beneath the water near Blackwater Point. Something connected to an abandoned mining operation. The captain had found a sealed underwater chamber containing equipment, crates, and records belonging to a company that had officially ceased operations years earlier. The records showed that the company had been secretly extracting something from the mountains and transporting it by sea. But Thomas did not identify the material. He wrote only one sentence that made Clara's hands tremble. They were not mining silver. The next section was almost impossible to read. Water damage had destroyed several lines, but the remaining words suggested that the captain had confronted the men responsible. The crew became divided. Some wanted to report what they had found. Others had been paid to remain silent. Then came the final sentence. If the bell is found, the ship is not far from where it was hidden. Clara looked toward the black window. Outside, the wind was rising. She had expected to find an artifact. She had not expected to find evidence that the most famous missing ship in the region had never been lost at all. And she had certainly not expected the brass key, because stamped into its surface was a symbol Clara recognized immediately. It was the same symbol her father had drawn repeatedly in the margins of his old survey maps. A circle, 3 lines, and a small mountain. For the first time, Clara realized her father had not sent her to Blackwater Point because he wanted her to find a wreck. He had sent her because he had already known the wreck was there. Somewhere beneath those mountains. Somewhere the locals had been told never to look. And somewhere, according to Thomas Reed's final message, the Mercy Bell was still waiting. Clara placed the letter beside her father's maps. Then she noticed something else. The brass key was wet. Not damp from the rain, wet with seawater. And it had been locked inside a sealed compartment for almost 30 years. Someone or something had recently brought it back from the ocean. That meant the bell had not been sitting untouched behind Silas Crowe's cabin. Someone had opened it before. Someone had known what was inside. And if that person was still alive, Clara had just become the only person in Blackwater Point who knew what they had been trying to hide. The next morning, Clara did not go looking for the wreck. She went looking for the man who had owned the diving bell before Silas Crowe. That search led her to an abandoned logging camp nearly 12 miles inland. The camp had been deserted since the winter of 1861. Only 3 buildings remained: a collapsed bunkhouse, a tool shed, and a stone storehouse built into the side of the mountain. Clara had found the location on one of her father's old maps. The same symbol stamped onto the brass key appeared beside the camp. Her father had written a single word beneath it: ventilation. At first, Clara thought it referred to an old mine. But when she reached the stone storehouse, she discovered something stranger. There was no mine entrance. Instead, there was a narrow shaft descending into the mountain. The shaft had been sealed with wooden beams. One beam had been recently cut. Clara knew immediately that somebody had been there. She descended. The tunnel eventually opened into a chamber. Inside were rusted tools, broken barrels, and fragments of old machinery. Then, she found a wall covered with numbers. They were not mining measurements, they were tide calculations. Clara realized what she was looking at. The chamber had once been connected to the sea. The miners had not simply been digging into the mountain. They had been building a hidden passage from the mountain to the water. The diving bell suddenly made sense. It was not merely a piece of rescue equipment. It had been used to inspect the underwater entrance to this passage. Clara returned to Blackwater Point and spent the night studying the old maps. By sunrise, she had reconstructed enough of the coastline to understand the plan. The Mercy Bell had not been heading toward the open sea when the storm struck. It had been approaching a narrow inlet on the eastern side of the mountains. The inlet was hidden behind cliffs. A ship entering it would disappear from view of anyone standing along the main coast. If the vessel had been deliberately concealed there, no ordinary search party would have found it. But there was another problem. The inlet was accessible only during a short period of low tide. That explained the tide calculations. The Mercy Bell had been carrying equipment needed to enter the hidden passage. The ship's disappearance had not been an accident. It had been part of a plan. Clara returned to the shoreline with the brass key. At low tide, she found a narrow iron door beneath a cliff. The key fit. Inside was a flooded passage. Clara could not enter far enough to see where it led. But carved into the stone above the doorway were the initials T.R. Thomas Reed. She knew then that his letter had not been a confession. It was a set of instructions. The copper cylinder contained another item that she had overlooked: a thin strip of brass engraved with numbers. When Clara compared the numbers with her father's survey records, they matched a series of coastal coordinates. One coordinate pointed directly toward the hidden inlet. Another pointed toward a small island offshore. The final coordinate pointed toward deep water. Clara understood what that meant. The wreck had been moved. The Mercy Bell had not been destroyed where the storm occurred. Someone had intentionally moved it from the inlet and sunk it in deeper water. But why? The answer came from an old journal Clara found in the abandoned storehouse. The journal belonged to a mining supervisor named Edwin Hale. Hale had recorded shipments leaving the mountains. The cargo was described as black ore, but the quantities were enormous, and the destination was not a legal port. The shipments disappeared into private hands. The mine had been operated by a company called North Star Consolidated. Official records claimed the mine produced silver. Hale's journal told a different story. The company had discovered a mineral deposit that was valuable enough to attract investors from across the coast. But the deposit was unstable. Workers began dying underground. Hale wrote that the company ordered the deaths recorded as accidents. Then the workers discovered something else. The mineral was not the only valuable thing inside the mountain. There were old structures beneath the mine. Structures built by people who had been there long before the settlement existed. No one knew who built them. The company tried to keep the discovery secret. The Mercy Bell had been sent to inspect an underwater tunnel connected to those structures. Captain Crow had refused to participate in the cover-up. Thomas Reed had agreed to help him. That was why the ship disappeared. The crew had discovered evidence that could destroy several powerful men. So the ship was hidden. The crew was divided. Some were murdered. Others were bribed. And the official story became a storm. But Clara still did not know where the wreck was. Then she noticed something in Hale's journal. Every shipment had been recorded by date and tide. She compared those dates with Thomas Reed's coordinates. The pattern revealed a route. The Mercy Belle had been used as a floating warehouse. Cargo was transferred from the mountain through the underwater passage. Then the ship transported it to a second location. That location was the island. Clara traveled there by a small fishing boat borrowed from Elias Vane. The island was nothing more than a rocky patch of land, covered in pine trees. There were no buildings, no ruins, nothing obvious. But Clara found a stone marker beneath the roots of an old tree. The marker carried the same mountain symbol. Beneath it was a date. October 17th, 1849. The date the Mercy Belle disappeared. Clara began digging. She found an iron ring buried beneath the soil. When she pulled it, a stone slab moved. Below it was a narrow chamber. Inside were empty crates, rusty chains, and dozens of glass bottles. Most were broken. One remained intact. It contained black mineral dust. Clara did not touch it. Instead, she looked at the wall. Someone had written a message there. The ship is below. But the wall pointed toward the sea, not the island. Clara returned to Blackwater Point, convinced that the final coordinate from her father's map was the key. The wreck had been deliberately sunk. But the question remained. Why would someone sink an entire ship after already hiding it? The answer arrived that night. A storm destroyed part of the old pier. When the tide withdrew, a section of seabed became visible. Clara saw something beneath the water, a metal structure. She dove at first light, and there, beneath layers of mud, she found the top of a ship's mast. The Mercy Belle had finally been found, but it was not lying on the seabed where it had been expected. It was inside a narrow underwater canyon. The wreck had been intentionally wedged between two cliffs. Someone had wanted it hidden forever. Clara climbed back into the boat. Then she saw the name carved into the surviving section of the hull. The legendary wreck was real, but the ship was not empty. And the thing locked inside it was the reason somebody had spent 29 years making sure nobody ever found it. Clara returned to the wreck with diving equipment borrowed from the settlement. The equipment was primitive. There were no modern breathing tanks. The only practical method available was the same technology that had been used with the original diving bell. That was why the rusted bell mattered. It was not just evidence. It was the only reason Clara could safely reach the wreck. She descended slowly. The water was black beneath the cliffs. The ship appeared in fragments. The mast was broken. The deck had collapsed. The hull was covered in marine growth. But the main cargo hold remained surprisingly intact. Clara entered through a gap near the stern. Inside, she found crates. Most were empty. Others contained corroded tools. Then she found something unexpected. A wooden box, sealed with the same black pitch used on the diving bell. The brass key opened it. Inside were documents. Not treasure, not gold. Records, names, payments, dates, shipping routes. The names belonged to businessmen, mining officials, ship captains, judges, and government contractors. The records showed that North Star Consolidated had been illegally removing the mysterious mineral from the mountain and selling it through a private network. But that was not the worst discovery. The mineral had been used to produce a chemical compound valuable to industrial manufacturers. The company had been making enormous profits while reporting almost nothing. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had disappeared through false accounts, and workers who knew too much had vanished. The Mercy Belle had been carrying proof. That was why it had been hunted. But Clara found one more document. It was written by Captain Nathaniel Crow. He explained what happened on the night the ship disappeared. But the sinking had been staged. Crow had ordered the ship into the hidden canyon after realizing armed men were following them. He had intended to protect the documents until he could reach authorities. But the crew was betrayed. Someone opened the lower flood valves. Water rushed into the ship. Crow tried to stop it. Thomas Reed helped him. They managed to move the evidence into the sealed cargo compartment. Then the ship sank. Crow and Reed survived long enough to escape through the diving bell, but they never reached the settlement. Crow had been injured, Reed had stayed behind. The final entry explained why. Someone must remain with the evidence. Clara understood. Thomas Reed had not drowned. He had hidden the evidence, he had survived the wreck, and he had eventually returned to Blackwater Point. But who was he? Clara found the answer in a graveyard outside the settlement. There was a grave marked Thomas R. Bell. The date of death was 1871, 7 years before Clara arrived. The grave had no mention of his connection to the Mercy Bell, but the initials matched. Clara realized Thomas Reed had spent the rest of his life protecting the secret. He had disguised his identity. He had hidden the diving bell. He had waited until the people responsible were dead or too old to pursue him. But one problem remained. If Thomas Reed had hidden the evidence, why had the bell appeared beside Silas Crow's cabin? The answer came from Elias Vane. When Clara confronted him, the old fisherman finally admitted that he had known more than he had said. He had been 16 when the Mercy Bell disappeared. His father had been one of the men paid to keep silent. Elias had watched armed men arrive on the coast after the ship vanished. They were searching for something. Years later, Silas Crow had found the diving bell. He brought it inland. He told Elias never to ask what was inside. Clara asked him why he had never spoken. Elias answered that fear had a long memory in isolated places. People in Blackwater Point had survived by forgetting. But Clara had not come there to forget. She returned to the wreck. This time she searched the sealed compartment beneath the cargo hold. Behind a layer of rotted wood, she found a second message. It was addressed to her father. That was impossible. Her father had not been born when the Mercy Bell disappeared. Yet the letter explained everything. Thomas Reed had discovered that the company responsible for the illegal mine had continued operating through descendants and shell businesses. He had spent years tracing the network. Eventually, he contacted Clara's father, the Coast. He had promised to protect the evidence, but he never managed to finish the investigation. His illness stopped him. Before he died, he gave Clara the final clue. The wreck, the diving bell, the symbol. All three were connected. The last page contained a warning. The documents are not the greatest danger. The mountain is. Clara initially thought it was a metaphor. It wasn't. The company had not been searching for the mineral alone. Deep beneath the mountain was a natural chamber filled with enormous deposits. But the chamber was unstable. The mining operation had weakened the mountain. The old tunnels were collapsing. If the sealed passages were disturbed, the entire coastal valley could flood. The company had known. They had hidden the truth because evacuating the settlement would expose the mine. For decades, the people of Blackwater Point had been living beneath a geological trap, and Clara's discovery of the underwater passage meant the old system was beginning to fail. Water was already entering the abandoned tunnels. The mountain was shifting. The wreck was not merely a historical mystery anymore. It was a warning. Clara had less than a day to convince the settlement to leave, but she could not simply tell them about a shipwreck. She needed proof. So she carried the documents from the wreck back to Blackwater Point. The next morning, she gathered the families in the chapel. She spread the records across the table. Names, payments, maps, mining records, and finally, the letter from Thomas Reed. The room went silent. Elias Vane recognized his father's name among the records. He began to cry. Not because he was surprised, because he finally understood why his father had spent his entire life refusing to speak about the Mercy Bell. Then the mountain moved. A deep sound rolled beneath the settlement. Windows shook, chimneys cracked, and somewhere beyond the chapel, the ground split open. The secret buried beneath Blackwater Point had finally begun to surface. The evacuation began before sunrise. Clara knew they could not save everything. The settlement had no horses for every family. The main road was blocked by fallen trees. The safest route was the old coastal trail leading north. But nobody knew whether the trail was still passable. The mountain continued to groan. Snow began falling. People carried children, blankets, food, tools, and whatever belongings they could carry. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Blackwater Point was moving as one group. Clara stayed behind. She had one final reason: the diving bell. She returned to the shoreline with Elias. The tide was rising. If the underwater passage collapsed while they were there, they would never escape. But Clara believed the bell contained one final clue. She had examined it again and noticed a small iron plate beneath the inner compartment. Behind the plate was a narrow cavity. Inside was a second brass strip. It contained coordinates, not for the wreck, for the mountain. Clara compared them with her father's maps. The coordinates pointed toward the original mine entrance. She and Elias climbed there. Inside the abandoned tunnels, they discovered the truth. The mining company had constructed enormous supports beneath the mountain. Some were still standing, others had rotted away. Water from the sea was entering the tunnels through the underwater passage. The entire system had become unstable. But Clara also found something that changed the meaning of Thomas Reed's final warning. The mountain was not going to collapse because of the mineral. It was going to collapse because someone had recently reopened the old tunnels. Someone had been searching for the documents. The person had followed Clara. She found fresh footprints, not from the villagers, not from Elias. Someone else had entered the mine within. The last few days, Clara followed the footprints. They led to a chamber containing the remains of the old mining operation. There were fresh tools, fresh lantern oil, and a table covered with papers. Someone had been studying the same maps. Then Clara found the final journal. It belonged to Silas Crow, not the captain, the trapper who had owned the diving bell. He had found the wreck years earlier. He had recovered the bell. He had also recovered part of the evidence. But he had never opened the sealed compartment. He believed the bell contained something dangerous. He was right. Silas had spent decades watching people search the coastline. Some came pretending to be fishermen. Others came pretending to be surveyors. All were looking for the same thing, the documents. But Silas refused to reveal where he had found the bell. Before his death, he wrote one sentence: "I hid it where nobody would search, because nobody believes the dead can move." Clara finally understood. The bell had been hidden behind his cabin, in plain sight. The greatest secret had survived, not because it was buried deep. It survived because everyone assumed the story was over. Clara took the journal. Then the mountain shook again. A section of tunnel collapsed behind them. Elias shouted that they had to leave, but Clara saw something beneath the broken stones. A wooden door. She opened it. Beyond it was a chamber untouched for nearly 30 years. Inside was the final evidence. The original cargo from the Mercy Bell. Crates of records, personal belongings, the captain's log, and a small metal box. Clara opened it. Inside was a photograph. Not of a person, of the mountain. Taken from the sea. On the back was written, "The wreck was never the secret." Clara stared at the words. The ship had been hidden because it carried evidence. The evidence had been hidden because it exposed the mine. But the mine had been hidden because the people who controlled it knew the mountain itself contained something valuable, something they wanted to continue exploiting. Clara carried the documents out. The settlement had already reached higher ground. She arrived just before the coastal road disappeared beneath a landslide. From the ridge, the people watched as part of Blackwater Point collapsed into the sea. The chapel disappeared. The general store disappeared. The old pier disappeared. And beneath the waves, the Mercy Bell vanished again. This time, nobody would find it easily. But Clara had already recovered what mattered. Months later, the documents reached the authorities. Investigators confirmed the financial records. The illegal mining operation was exposed. The names in the documents led to arrests, lawsuits, and the closure of several companies. But the mystery of the Mercy Bell remained. Some believed the ship had been deliberately sunk. Others believed the storm had finally destroyed it after all. Clara never publicly revealed everything she had found beneath the mountain. She knew some places were better left alone. Years later, she returned to Blackwater Point. There was almost nothing left. Only a few stone foundations remained above the waterline. She stood on the shore where she had first seen the rusted diving bell. The bell itself had been preserved. It sat inside a small coastal museum built far from the original settlement. Visitors came to see it. They looked at the rusted iron. But almost none of them understood the strangest part. The bell had cost Clara $3. $3 for an object everyone else considered useless. $3 for a piece of rusted metal that had been ignored for decades. $3 that bought her a doorway into a story the entire region had spent 30 years trying to forget. And hidden inside that bell was proof that the most famous wreck on that coast had not simply disappeared. It had been erased. The men responsible believed distance, water, isolation, and time would destroy the truth. They were wrong, because sometimes history does not disappear. Sometimes it waits. It waits inside a rusted machine, inside a forgotten grave, inside an abandoned mountain tunnel, inside a letter nobody thinks to read. And sometimes it waits for one person to spend $3 on something everyone else has already decided is worthless. Clara never became famous. She never claimed the treasure. She never tried to turn the story into a legend. She simply kept the brass key, the same key she had pulled from the diving bell. When she died many years later, it was found among her personal papers. There was no explanation, only a single handwritten sentence. Some wrecks are hidden beneath the water. Others are hidden beneath the truth. And that is why the Mercy Bell remains one of the strangest lost ship stories ever connected to Blackwater Point. Because the real mystery was never how the ship sank. It was why someone wanted the world to believe it had. And the woman who paid $3 for a rusted diving bell was the first person in nearly 30 years brave enough to ask the question nobody else wanted answered.